John Walton will be arraigned today if he can come up with a lawyer. This is the third attempt at an arraignment. Hasn't been able to find a lawyer. We will see, but clearly he is central to this case.
Yeah, and that's where I wanted to go with you, Danny, is this idea. As of last night, he still had not retained, it appears, a lawyer who could represent him in a Florida courtroom. This would appear to be a stall tactic, which we've all sort of anticipated Trump and his team would utilize. So what's your sense of this? Like, is there anything that can be done to compel him to show up and to make this arraignment happen? And what's your just overarching sense of the timeline of this case? We know Jack Smith's the one who said, hey, let's move from August to December, but they're sending clear signals. We don't want to be delayed any further than December.
A couple things here. Defendants will often use the hiring an attorney as a ploy to delay. It works only to a point. At some point, for example, at an arraignment, a judge might just say, look, have the public defender stand in for you. We need to move this case along. The arraignment, at least it's substantively important, but practically speaking, virtually any attorney can stand in. And that includes maybe even a public defender. Now, if I'm a federal judge in this case, I would be very concerned about just forcing a public defender on this high-profile defendant. But believe me, in state court, this happens all the time. Judges will not countenance these maneuvers if a defendant is trying to delay. But on a larger point, I've been saying this since the beginning, watch Walt Nauta in this case. Yes, it may be true that he has expressed no interest in cooperating with federal investigators or federal prosecutors, but as anyone who has prosecuted these kinds of sprawling white-collar type cases will tell you, that decision may change over time. As this case winds on and as the fatigue sets in and Walt Nauta gets a better idea of what he's facing, he may change his mind about cooperation and look no further than this already disparate treatment. If it's true that Trump is footing, say, the legal bills or supporting him in other ways, already by the arraignment, Walt Nauta is in a different position. Trump's already been arraigned. Walt Nauta has yet to be arraigned because he doesn't yet have an attorney. Now, is Walt Nauta and is Donald Trump, are they fine with that? Is that part of the plan? Is this no big deal? Maybe, but Walt Nauta might start thinking, hey, wait a minute. The big guy, he had a lawyer at the arraignment. He's all covered. I haven't even been arraigned yet because I don't have a lawyer. And maybe, look, maybe he's fine with that. Okay, that's part of the plan. We're still a team. We're still a joint defense agreement. We're still together, aligned in this case. But what happens down the line when Walt Nauta starts seeing other disparate treatment, other broken promises where Trump said, we're going to be together the entire way on this, and now maybe a year from now, when I still think this case will be going, there's absolutely no way this case is going to trial in this calendar year. But as the months wind on, will Walt Nauta start thinking, hey, this isn't the together team that I thought we were in from the beginning. Maybe I ought to start thinking about cooperation. And
if it wasn't for your vote, we would not have Joe Biden in the White House. That was a constitutional right that you had to send those votes back to the states.
States conduct our elections. You never want to let Washington, D.C. run elections. The Constitution affords no authority for the Vice President or anyone else to reject votes or return votes to the states. Never been done before. Should never be done in the future. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's actually what the Constitution says.
Hey, this time of year, we all keep getting pinged with political fundraising asks. But here's the thing. Giving $5 or $10, whatever you can, to Joe Biden's campaign makes a real difference. Let me tell you why. From a guy who's won a couple of these. Donations from grassroots supporters like you made up the majority of Joe's campaign revenue last time. And those $5, $10, $20 donations are what helped him win the election.
President Trump was wrong about my authority that day, and he's still wrong.
So that is former Vice President Mike Pence in Iowa yesterday defending himself after a woman falsely claimed he had the constitutional power to block the certification of the 2020 election results, a calm takedown of that conspiracy theory. Good morning. Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Thursday, July 6th. With us this morning, we have U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News, Caddy Kay, the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude Jr., and MSNBC legal analyst, Danny Savalos. Danny, we got a busy morning for you just ahead. But, John, that was a fascinating moment at the Pizza Ranch in Sioux City, a place a lot of us have been in the campaign trail, where Mike Pence, for all the criticisms we've rightly levied upon him over the last 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years, it was sort of a measured takedown and a point-by-point rebuttal of something that really is prominent, really did take hold, as you write about in your book, The Big Lie, that Mike Pence had the power to, quote, send it back to the states and give the election to Donald Trump.
Yeah, Mike Pence was right there. He did not have that power, and it is a credit to him, with an assist from Dan Quayle,
yes,
unlikely defender of the Republic, that he stood his ground that day and resisted that pressure from Donald Trump, a man whom he had served loyally throughout their 4 years in office, and broke with him at the most important moment. But the fact that he is still now dealing with this 2.5 years later in Iowa, the state where he has placed a bet on his entire campaign, thinking he could do well with the evangelicals there, shows just what an uphill climb he has and why his poll numbers remain so low, but also just demonstrate the grip that Donald Trump still has on this party and that his lies have completely taken hold. They've been repeated in the conservative media ecosystem. They are on social media wherever you can find. Trump repeats them day after day. He has still, of course, not acknowledged his defeat. And it shows just how dangerous that lie is, and so many Republicans are still willing to believe it.
And that's the point, Eddie. It still is so pervasive. So if you are one of these Republicans taking on Donald Trump in a Republican primary, you go to Iowa, you go to New Hampshire, you go to South Carolina, that's what they're facing every day. People who confront them and say, isn't Donald Trump actually the president? And they hear that and they go, well, how do I take on Donald Trump when everyone whose vote I'm trying to win is so in the grip of everything he tells them?
And, you know, to parse in the grip, it becomes very difficult to figure out how do you convince them otherwise.
Right.
So the facts are what they are. Pence was very forthright, but did he actually convince her?
Right.
And that's the challenge, of course.
That is the challenge. We'll talk. Donald Trump yesterday, speaking of Ron DeSantis, said the campaign for Governor DeSantis is in, quote, total disarray. Trump made the comments on social media, writing in part, quote, Ron DeSanctimonious is getting absolutely demolished. No crowds, no enthusiasm, no interest. He's hurting himself very badly for 2028, wrote Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Governor DeSantis is defending a controversial and frankly bizarre campaign video that attacks former President Donald Trump's views on LGBTQ rights. The video features past tweets and comments by Trump and the recent legislation DeSantis has signed in the state of Florida.
I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens.
If Caitlyn Jenner were to walk into Trump Tower and want to use the bathroom, you would be fine with her using any bathroom she chooses.
That is correct.
In the future, can transgender women compete in Miss Universe?
Yes.
Make America great again.
Donnie Deutsch, ad man extraordinaire. What am I looking at there?
Ad man extraordinaire is stumped, okay? I've been doing this for a long time.
What are we doing here? What are we doing here?
And the answer is, well, first of all, DeSantis is flailing, and he's trying to continually move to the right of Trump. But this LGBTQ thing is just, do you think this is moving voters? Are you, and to paint Trump as a patron of this group is, you know, as an ad guy, there's one thing I learned over the years is people aren't stupid, okay? You just, and I don't know the voter that's going to see that and go, you know what, Trump, I'm gone. DeSantis, you're my guy. And DeSantis is such a dark character. I've talked a lot about it on the show, how at the end of the day, a candidate, Trump, even though, you know, we eviscerate him, and there is a likability if you're a Trump guy about him. He's entertaining, he's a lounge act, he's this and that. This guy is just the prince of darkness, and that is one of the darkest, most bizarre, twisted, deviant ads I've ever seen.
Well, he was defending it yesterday. Bipartisan backlash to the video, by the way. Many people calling it homophobic. Governor DeSantis standing by the ad, calling it fair game.
I think, identifying Donald Trump as really being a pioneer in injecting gender ideology into the mainstream, where he was having men compete against women in his beauty pageants. I think that's totally fair game, because he's now campaigning saying the opposite, that he doesn't think that you should have men competing in women's things like athletics. And so we've been very clear on it, that we believe in protecting the rights of our girls and the rights of women athletes to be able to participate with fairness and with integrity.
In response to those remarks, Trump campaign spokesperson said, quote, "A desperate DeSantis campaign with a flailing candidate is in its last throes of relevancy." Mara, it's been said many times in the last several months of Governor DeSantis that he's just playing very, very small ball, and that he's picking on these issues. He's trying to win a national election right now, and he's going after regressive things and leaning into his anti-woke agenda. I'm sure that works with a small group of supporters and a lot of people in this country it may resonate with, but you're trying to broaden the coalition. You're not just supposed to preach to the choir to win a national election.
I mean, it's like he went to finishing school at the Heritage Foundation or something. I mean, I don't know who he thinks this is resonating with. It's not. I also just have to say, in the ad itself, a couple people have said this, it is kind of homoerotic. I mean, there's something about the ad that's a little bit, odd to begin with. And then, of course, broadening that out, though, I really feel strongly that, men who are secure in their own masculinity don't feel the need to shout about it from the rooftops everywhere they go and denigrate others. It's small-minded. It makes him look small, and it's embarrassing. So, I mean, sometimes when you see open hate like that, the best thing that you can do is condemn it, but also, knock it down a few pegs. And this is just really silly. I mean, I can't imagine what Americans are going to see this and have this change their mind. It might motivate Democratic voters to start paying attention. And I think if that's what he succeeded in, that may be what we're looking at.
I'm smiling because I remember a gay friend of mine saying, was that an anti-gay ad? I saw a lot of Brad Pitt looking hot and shirtless dudes.
There was a gladiator.
Flexing. Yeah, there's a gladiator.
I know, he was great.
Yeah, if Donnie doesn't get it, nobody gets it in an ad.
Hey, I'm Joey, and I'm one of the 30 AI voices from SpeechLab. You listened to this video until now and you probably couldn't tell I'm not a real human voice. That's because I understand exactly what each phrase is saying, and I know how to put in.
Well, we've got some more news on the Supreme Court rulings handed down last week. One of them on affirmative action, another on student loan forgiveness, and a case that allows businesses to refuse service to LGBTQ Americans if they have a religious objection. Conservatives in Congress and across the country applauded those decisions. Democrats on Capitol Hill united against them. Polling, perhaps, though, is less cut and dried. A Washington Post poll late last year showed 63% of Americans were against considering race in college admissions. Only 36% agree with that idea. For the ruling on refusing LGBTQ people's services, results vary widely based on how the poll's question is asked. In a Pew poll from a few months back, 60% of American adults said they were in favor of a business refusing to provide service in situations where it could suggest support for LGBTQ issues for which they have a religious objection. And a recent NBC News poll that asked if voters supported President Loan's student loan forgiveness plan showed 44% say it was a bad idea versus 43% in favor. Let's bring in Director of Polling at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, John Della Volpe. He's an MSNBC contributor and author of the book titled Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. That's now out in paperback. John. Good morning. So you got some new polling for us today. What are some of your takeaways about how young people are feeling about what's happening at the Supreme Court and beyond?
Thanks, Willie, for having me. Yes, this is a review of a couple of decades of polling that we've been conducting at the Harvard Institute of Politics. And essentially, when I look at younger voters, 18 to 29-year-olds, mostly Gen Z, keep in mind that this cohort, 18 to 29-year-olds, with their older millennial brothers and sisters, will be about 40% of the electorate. And when I look at this cohort today compared to this place in the 2020 cycle, I find that younger people are less likely to vote. They're less likely to identify as Democrat. They are less likely to follow the news, and they are less likely, importantly, to believe that politics can make a tangible difference in the country and in their lives individually.
And that's just a frustration with the system that they have watched since they were born fail them again and again in so many different ways. So what is your sense of the way these Supreme Court decisions, John, may impact the energy to go out and vote, the energy to become active in the process?
Yeah, I think, Willie, the combination of the Supreme Court and the Republican Congress, we talk about baseball, it's like a hanging curveball over the plate for Democrats. But Democrats need to identify that and to take advantage of that. This is just the second year in a row where younger people continue to feel under attack. A year ago, of course, we know it's a third of women losing, a third of women in individual states losing control of their reproductive health. And today we see kind of attacks on members of the LGBTQ community. We see it more difficult for working class and people of color to attend college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's one attack after another, and that's just by the Supreme Court. You know, earlier you talked about what's happening in Florida and other places like that as well, in terms of this generation really responding, I think, hopefully to kind of stand up and get the backs of those who are more vulnerable even than themselves.
And Mara, last year we saw a seismic shift after the Dobbs decision, completely energizing women, in particular young women, to go out and vote in the midterm elections and changing the face of our politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions I have looking at that data is whether there's anything that can actually bring some of those voters back. I mean, you saw much higher turnout, for example, in states like Michigan, where their abortion was a direct ballot issue. So is that something that not only Democrats, but those who support women's right to choose, for example, need to look at? And the Democratic Party should be looking at this data and should be concerned. I mean, it also really puts that question to the White House. What can this president really do about the loan forgiveness failure at SCOTUS? Because there are a lot of Americans who are extremely demoralized by that decision. That's exactly the kind of group that you want to show up at the polls. Remember that there's a close alignment between college voters and Democrats at this point. Excuse me, college people with a college degree and Democrats. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of data to parse here. I don't know that these voters are moving over to the Republican Party. They're just becoming inactive. The larger question of what it says about our politics is pretty depressing, as we've been saying this morning. Some depressing news to parse through, because it suggests that there's not much trust in the system, and this is a generation of kids, of people, of young people who have been failed, as you said, you know, by the failure of gun control, climate change, and now the collapse of the Democratic coalition, it seems, or the risk of it, with the rise of fascism. So it's depressing times, and I think we need those voters back in this system. We need a competitive system, and you can't just lose an entire generation of voters.
Yeah, you think about it, though, you know, just think about what has happened between the midterms and now, right? During the midterms, when we think about Wisconsin, when we think about Michigan, and we think about the role of young voters, particularly in Wisconsin. In some places, we were actually saying on this show that young folk actually helped save our democracy. But when I look at your numbers, John, I see the rate, the percentage of young people, black, Hispanic, and white, who are disappointed in President Biden's performance. What is the relationship between, right, what we saw in the midterms, that kind of energy, and these sorts of numbers? It's not like it's 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. It's just a midterm. So help us understand these disapproval numbers with regards to the Biden administration.
Eddie, what we first need to understand is that without younger people, there isn't a Biden administration. It was young people in particular in the 5 battleground states in 2020, similar approach in 2022, which made the difference in state after state after state. And essentially, kind of the message of this, I think, research is that past results are no guarantee of future returns. The Democrats need to take this seriously and specifically talk about the tangible differences that the Biden administration has made. I don't don't believe in my lifetime there's been an agenda that's been more youth forward than the Biden agenda. When you look at when you look at bipartisan support for gun safety legislation, a couple generations hasn't happened since then. When you look at the record low employment in 17 states, I think, and a variety of other things like the significant investment climate, but they're not feeling it on a day-to-day basis. That's the concern. When I look at the significant news in Philadelphia on 95, I mean, that helps young people in particular, helps them get to work, helps them spend time with their young families, it helps people get back to work in terms of deliveries. That's something that specifically isn't just about building infrastructure, it's about impacting day-to-day lives. And that's the kind of message I think that needs to be delivered, not just from the president, but from everyone all the way down to dog catcher.
So, John, you talk to and work with Gen Z, millennial voters all the time. If you were speaking to the Biden campaign right now, if you were talking to Democrats, where would you tell them they need to put their emphasis to get them energized to go out and vote next year?
Well, Willie, whenever I'm invited to talk to Democrats, I bring my students with me, and I let them actually answer those questions. And I think that's something that we need to do more of. We need to have younger people kind of at the table. But I do think more than that, it's basically a two-step process to engage young people in voting. It's not just about persuasion. It's about kind of connecting with values and building kind of the infrastructure around the importance that politics can make. I believe we've had a party that's delegitimized the process, delegitimize politics, and we need to kind of improve that brand that can make a difference.
Director of Polling at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, John Della Volpe. John, thanks so much for bringing us the numbers today. We appreciate it. And John, obviously this will be an emphasis for the Biden campaign as they turn the corner to the new year. They have to get this young coalition of voters to the polls.
Yeah, they know it. They were able to in 20. Democrats were able to, for the most part, in 22. But Donnie, this looms large, and the word I keep coming back to is enthusiasm. That is something that I think some Democrats are getting anxious about. We're seeing polls like this that show that young voters are disenchanted with the process, that they have seen blow after blow handed down by the Supreme Court and other institutions saying, this is not how I feel about things like abortion or gun rights or climate change or affirmative action or student loans. The list goes on and on. And we have seen that their polls suggest that Democrats, a number of them who like President Biden and think he's done a good job, just aren't sure they really want him to run again. And that includes young voters. That includes voters of color. For all the structural advantages a president has, sometimes seeking re-election with a good record, the fear is that Democrats might not be enthusiastic enough, especially voters on those swing voters, to come out again. And while we know that if it's Donald Trump on the other side, his base is going to be enthusiastic. There's going to be passion there. They're going to turn out. Is it risky for Democrats to say, well, hey, if Trump's the nominee, voters will be enthusiastic to turn out against him rather than for what we're offering?
That is where the passion is. The passion certainly is not for Joe Biden. And, when we talk to our contemporaries, I'm 65 years old, and you talk about Biden, what's the first concern? Age. Now imagine you're a 25-year-old voter. And you're saying, wait a second, it's just purely based on that. This is my country, and we're going to have an 80-year-old or an 82-year-old running the country. The age thing, as you know, this is not something that's complicated. As you go further down, younger, the age is going to become more and more of an issue. So there's no surprise that when you look for enthusiasm on the Democratic side, the leader, it's not there. Do I still think the passion against Trump will rule the day? Yes, but you're not going to get the passion for Biden, particularly as you skew younger.
But it's not a fantasy camp. You don't get to pick your candidate out of thin air, the one you love, right, Mara? It's a side-by-side comparison. You pick one over the other. And in this case, Joe Biden is it if you're a young Democrat.
I think that policy can overcome some of this, not with every voter. Joe Biden, I think, the best advice is own your age. Be the coolest grandfather that America can imagine. And say, I care about my grandkids, the future, and he does this pretty well, actually. Get him out there talking about, passing the torch. What's he going to do for this young generation that he can actually, oversee from the White House? Make him look cooler than SCOTUS. I think that's kind of the best bet at this point. There's room to play if they're creative about it.
A lot of people don't know this, but the best way to make money on YouTube in 2023 is not by becoming a YouTuber or making your own YouTube videos.
campaign, but we also were learning new details this morning about the search of former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago Golf Club carried out by federal agents last year after a less redacted version of the search warrant affidavit was made public yesterday. The newly public portions of that document reveal the federal agents investigating Trump's connection to classified materials told the judge who signed the search warrant they were concerned the location of some of the documents was unknown. The affidavit indicates Justice Department officials became concerned after viewing security camera footage from Mar-a-Lago that they obtained from Trump's company. The affidavit reveals the video showed a Trump employee, since identified as aide and former White House valet Walt Nauta, moving boxes out of a storage area where Trump and his lawyers previously had acknowledged keeping classified documents. Those same videos were referred to in the criminal indictment filed against Trump and Nauta last month. The indictment also stated documents had been stored at a number of locations, including Trump's office, residence, a ballroom stage, and now infamously inside a bathroom. The federal judge in Florida who signed off on the August search warrant, Magistrate Judge Bruce Reinhart, ordered the additional information from that affidavit be made public yesterday. But he denied a request by media organizations, including NBC News, that the entire affidavit be unsealed. So, Danny, this is a search warrant that we had seen, but it was heavily redacted. Now we get a little bit of a look inside of it because of this ruling from the judge. As you look through it, what's new to you beside the fact that we have this video footage of Walt Nauta moving documents out of the storage facility, which is the place Trump and his aides had said it was all in there, it was all secure. We now know otherwise.
Well, that fleshes out the indictment for us because it tells us now what we didn't know when the document was sealed, at least partially sealed or redacted, I should say, that in fact Walt Nauta specifically may have been moving documents, and there was this concern that we think we know, at least from what we've been told, where these documents are, and they're not there. We think there are additional documents. We've seen them on video, and that makes us better understand this indictment, which alleges that Trump may have misled his attorneys. His attorneys took that information and gave it to federal investigators. And by the way, for me, that has been the vindicating force the entire time for attorneys in general, which is the idea that there was a suggestion during this investigation that Trump's attorneys may have been complicit in hiding these documents. Now, maybe as a lawyer that concerned me, and I hoped and prayed that that was not the case. It seems that it was not the case. It seems that from the indictment that Trump misled his attorneys. His attorneys took that information and gave it to federal investigators. And I can tell you, as a lawyer, every defense attorney in America can tell you a story of being led down a path by their clients. It happens all the time. And unfortunately, sometimes attorneys take that information and give it to federal investigators or law enforcement or something else. So this is something that I think we knew, that now that this has been unredacted, now we can see that the information that was concealed may have been by Trump and by Walt Nauta, who was probably just carrying out orders by Trump or someone close to him.
And John, Walt Nauta will be arraigned today if he can come up with a lawyer. This is the third attempt at an arraignment. Still haven't been able to find a lawyer. We will see, but clearly he is central to this case.
Yeah, and that's where I wanted to go with you, Danny, is this idea, as of last night, he still had not retained, it appears, a lawyer who could represent him in a Florida courtroom. This would appear to be a stall tactic, of which we've all sort of anticipated Trump and his team would utilize. So what's your sense of this? Like, is there anything that could be done to compel him to show up and to make this arraignment happen? And what's your just overarching sense of the timeline of this case? We know Jack Smith's the one who said, hey, let's move from August to December, but they're sending clear signals. We don't want it to be delayed any further than December.
A couple things here. Defendants will often use the hiring an attorney as a ploy to delay. It works only to a point. At some point, for example, at an arraignment, a judge might just say, look, have the public defender stand in for you. We need to move this case along. The arraignment, at least, it's substantively important, but practically speaking, virtually any attorney can stand in, and that includes maybe even a public defender. Now, if I'm a federal judge in this case, I would be very concerned about just forcing a public defender on this high-profile defendant. But believe me, in state court, this happens all the time. Judges will not countenance these maneuvers if a defendant is trying to delay. But On a larger point, I've been saying this since the beginning. Watch Walt Nauta in this case. Yes, it may be true that he has expressed no interest in cooperating with federal investigators or federal prosecutors, but as anyone who has prosecuted these kinds of sprawling white-collar type cases will tell you, that decision may change over time. As this case winds on and as the fatigue sets in and Walt Nauta gets a better idea of what he's facing, he may change his mind about cooperation and look no further than this already disparate treatment. If it's true that Trump is footing, say, the legal bills or supporting him in other ways, already by the arraignment, Walt Nauta is in a different position. Trump's already been arraigned. Walt Nauta has yet to be arraigned because he doesn't yet have an attorney. Now, is Walt Nauta and is Donald Trump, are they fine with that? Is that part of the plan? Is this no big deal? Maybe, but Walt Nauta might start thinking, hey, wait a minute. The big guy, he had a lawyer at the arraignment. He's all covered. I haven't even been arraigned yet because I don't have a lawyer. And maybe, look, maybe he's fine with that. Okay, that's part of the plan. We're still a team. We're still a joint defense agreement. We're still together, aligned in this case. But what happens down the line when Walt Nauta starts seeing other disparate treatment, other broken promises where Trump said, we're going to be together the entire way on this, and now maybe a year from now, when I still think this case will be going, there's absolutely no way this case is going to trial in this calendar year. But as the months wind on, will Walt Nauta start thinking, hey, this isn't the together team that I thought we were in from the beginning. Maybe I ought to start thinking about cooperation.
And Caddy, Walt Nauta still is out there staffing Donald Trump, by the way. They're still side by side going to events and doing things together, even as they've been instructed not to speak about this case. We'll leave it to our audience to decide if Donald Trump will exercise that restraint.
I know. I thought of that too. It's pretty surreal, isn't it? The two are spending all of that time close together, and you know what it's like having a body man. They really are close. Well, I've never had a body man, but you've seen presidents with them. You know how close they are. And it's kind of hard to believe they never talk about this case in those private moments, perhaps going around the golf course or something. But Danny, something that you just briefly touched on earlier, and that's, so there's Walt, and is there anybody else? And I know there's only 2 people have been indicted, but just reading through that last bit that's been made public from the search warrant, having just spent, kind of very sweaty morning moving a child out of dorm rooms, moving 3 or 4 boxes, 50 boxes get moved out and 25 boxes get moved back in again. Walt's doing all of that by himself. I mean, that sort of stretches credulity, because we saw the pictures of those boxes just a second ago. We can put them back up again. That's what it looks like, 50 boxes. It's an awful lot. And it's kind of, I was just wondering if there's, somebody else must know something about what was happening.
Yes, they probably do, but I think it's safe to assume that Walt Nauta may be the only defendant we see charged with Trump. And here are my reasons for saying that. Number one, this is a long, sprawling investigation, and I have to believe that when federal prosecutors indicted this case, they believed they knew everything they had to know about every defendant they wanted to charge, because this is arguably the most important federal defendant in the history of American prosecution. So you better believe that when that indictment dropped, they knew and had a document to back up every single paragraph in that indictment. So it would surprise me if they decided to add a new defendant through a superseding indictment. But beyond that, to answer your question specifically, yes, I think there were additional people who may have known more about the boxes, but those people, when they got a phone call or a letter from federal prosecutors, probably raced in to tell them everything that they knew. And that's often the case in federal investigations. There probably are additional people who may have known more than they should have, or may have been somewhat complicit, but likely as not, they cooperated with federal investigators, and the government decided not to charge them. But then, of course, you're also going to have people who may have just been following orders. Hey, we need some of these boxes moved. They didn't look inside the boxes. They moved them around. So you're going to have a lot of people who are just minions with no actual knowledge of what they were doing. But are there people in that gray area? Absolutely. I would expect that there are. But those may be people who, as I said, rushed in, talked to federal investigators, and federal investigators and prosecutors exercised their discretion and probably just chose not to prosecute.
Eddie, sometimes you just have to take a step back and remind yourself about the volume of evidence in this case against Donald Trump. You've got photographs of the documents. You've got now video footage of Walt Nauta moving the documents. I'm remembering the quote from Bill Barr several weeks ago where he said, if half of what they put in this indictment is true, Donald Trump is toast.
Right.
That's his former attorney general.
If we weren't in bizarro world, we'd say he dead to rights, right? I mean,
Right.
it just seems pretty straightforward. Danny, you said something as you were talking that struck me. You said with a high level of confidence that this was not going to happen in this calendar year.
Still on metformin, although it was recalled? What if I told you there was a way to easily restore healthy blood sugar levels so you can get off?
No way. There's no way, and I'll tell you why.
Fascinating.
Yeah, the Speedy Trial Act requires that starting at indictment, the clock begins and all cases must be brought to trial within 70 days. Now, I add about 11 footnotes of exceptions to that rule in just a standard federal case. For example, if the defense starts filing motions, dispositive motions, motions to throw a case out, the judge has to decide those motions. They have to be briefed. That could add time to that could waive essentially the Speedy Trial Act. So that will add time to the case. In addition, you have security issues with putting a trial together. You're probably going to have to clear the entire courthouse. Everything moves glacially in whether it's federal court or state court. Federal court admittedly moves a lot faster than state court. It's probably a safe bet that Trump's federal case will come to trial before his New York case. And that's because simply the New York courts are much more clogged. They take longer to get to trial, but in federal court, they move very quickly. That being said, this is a complex, sprawling case. Walt Nauta hasn't even been arraigned yet, just to give you an idea. So all the best laid plans, even in federal court where they're much more efficient, they simply don't pan out because unexpected things happen. For example, how many weeks has it been and Walt Nauta has not yet been arraigned? And that's something that's supposed to happen right away. So to give you that as just an example, Eddie, that's something that's supposed to happen immediately after the indictment comes out. And it hasn't happened for one of the co-defendants. So the expectation that this case would be tried in this calendar year, it's just not going to happen. There's no way it can't happen. We haven't even started the dispositive motions, and those are coming, believe me. Donald Trump's team is going to file any number of motions to throw this case out entirely. So once those begin, that'll maybe give us a better idea, but it's not happening in this calendar year. Save the tape. Maybe don't save the tape, but save the tape.
And Fox News analyst Britt Hume. Here is what Britt said yesterday about Donald Trump's political track record.
Those losses in the midterms and eventually the presidency are not are disappointing performances and losses. They're real. They happened. There's no doubt about it. There's no way around it. And the case can be made that he's a loser because since he got elected in 2016, he's compiled a string of them. Or either he or his supported candidates have lost too many races. Right now, people are voting their hearts, and they tend to vote in primaries for the candidates that they feel closest to, or that they'd like to see president. They're not voting about who they think could get elected. That may come back to haunt the Republican Party in 2024 because you look at the Democrats and what they think of the race. They think that Trump is going to win the nomination, and they think Biden will beat him because he did beat him.
Let's bring in former White House Director of Communications to President Obama, Jen Palmieri. Jen, good morning. Great to see you as always. So Britt Hume didn't say anything earth-shattering there. He merely spoke the truth on Fox News about the results of the last several elections, just the way Vice President Pence, as we showed a little bit earlier, spoke the truth on the limits of what he could do on January 6th to a voter who was asking him why he didn't, quote, kick it back to the states so Donald Trump could win. The question we've been asking this morning, these are moments of truth-telling to Republicans watching, Republicans listening at campaign events. Do they matter? Are they all in with Donald Trump anyway?
I think it is too early to. I mean, Trump is doing great. A lot of polls have him at 51%. Anytime you're over 50 in a huge field like this, that is a very big lead, and it's hard to overcome. It is still early, so I think that you still cannot conclude that we're going to end up with Trump. We don't know that for sure. The message that I saw from Koch, that's an effective message if it came out of a candidate's mouth. And you don't see Chris Christie's making that argument. If Ron DeSantis wants to win, he should probably be making that argument. The Republican primary is about Donald Trump. it is about whether or not he can win, whether or not he's the best standard bearer, whether or not he has the hearts of the Republican electorate. And I think that, that's an effective argument. And I've heard Republican primary voters say to me they're worried that Trump can't beat Biden. They're still going with him because they feel in their gut that he's their guy. So that could be an effective argument, but candidates aren't making it. And unless a candidate is actually making that argument, I don't know that a third party group with like the Koch brothers is going to have a big impact.